Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and assalamu alaikum to everybody who's watching us, wherever you're watching us from. My name is Katarzyna, and I'm a member of the MACFEST team, and I'm joining you from France. Please tell us where you're watching us from. Tell us in the chat. And please share your comments, share your thoughts. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat or Q&A portal. First of all, I'd like to thank very much to all of you for your generous donations. All big and small make a difference because they help us create all these wonderful events for you. Most of them are free. We're already preparing the program for 2024, but we've got still quite a few coming up. If you're around in the UK, for example, next Saturday, we've got a wonderful women-only event in Longside Library. And if not then on the 1st of July, perhaps, we've got a musical event in the Lowry in Manchester, in Salford. Please check more details on Eventbrite. And follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and TikTok. And do use our hashtag #SpreadHoney, Today, we've got a great event, Muslim women in Australia, and our host, I will just introduce him, just a few words, is Professor Tahir Abbas. He's a professor of radicalization studies at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at LeidenUniversity in The Hague. But he was born in Birmingham. So as I'm reading his biography, I can see huge amount of different positions at different institutes and universities. It's absolutely amazing biography. If he could tell us a little bit more about it, it would be really wonderful. His research focuses on sociology, politics, Islamic studies, and critical terrorism studies, specifically exploring various forms of radicalization, extremism, and political violence. He authored 18 books and edited volumes, including Islamophobia and Securitization, and a few more. And currently, he's the scientific coordinator of the European Commission funded project called DRIVE, which examines how social exclusion impacts the radicalization of minority and majority groups in the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, and the United Kingdom. He is also the principal investigator on the EC-funded project Proton, which explores protecting religious places of worship in Europe, and he's a co-investigator on the EC-funded project called Prepare, which generates a proof of concept concerning young people and families who are returnees from countries of conflict. So I'm not going to take any more time. Over to you, Tahir, and if you could tell us a little bit more, that would be really wonderful.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you all for the opportunity that are here in this space, but also online, listening attentively. So, yeah, I mean, I can say a bit more about myself, apart from the fact that, as you say, I'm a scholar working on extremism studies, and I'm interested in Muslims in Europe, which is a useful link into the main person who is of interest today as part of this conversation. And so let me take a moment to introduce my colleague and friend from Australia, and to give you all a bit of a background. So, well, good afternoon from The Hague. It's a lovely sunny afternoon here. We're having a bit of a heat wave. As mentioned, I'm Tahir Abbas. I'm a professor of radicalization at Leiden University. So I'm the host for this conversation with Professor Samina Yasmeen. And before I provide a bit of a background, I want to take a few moments to introduce her. Straight off the bat, I want to mention that I first met her in 2008 when I was invited to join a Fulbright symposium in Australia. We were hosted by Samina and her wonderful colleagues in Perth and at the University of Western Australia. We had lengthy conversations with students, scholars, diplomats, politicians, an extensive 3-day conference, lots of wonderful dinners and breakfasts even. And it was a very monumental for me in terms of being an early career researcher and being with so many senior established colleagues and getting a real introduction to Australian society and politics, and an unforgettable experience for me. But today I have the pleasure to introduce Professor Samina. She's an extraordinary sociologist and is an esteemed international professor at the UWA's School of Social Sciences. So leading the Department of International Relations, Asian Studies and Politics, she breathes life into the field with a dynamic approach to teaching, research and activism. As the director of the Center for Muslim States and Societies and head of the department, she's a specialist in political and strategic developments in South Asia, in particular, the role of Islam in world politics and citizenship amongst minority and immigrant women. And she's going to be talking about that particular field today. And she's the author of numerous books and volumes. In 2012, she was elected Fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. And in June 2014, she received the award of the Member of the Order of Australia. Now, today, Professor Yasmeen's research has expanded to encompass multifaceted realms of Muslim identities. She looks at issues around extremism, delves into the relationship between women and extremist ideas, and also looks at de-radicalization and how it works or doesn't work. And all of this is informed by a profound understanding of domestic and foreign politics related to Pakistan in particular. In summary, Professor Yasmeen is an inspiring force in the field of sociology, pushing the frontiers of the study of international relations, Asian studies and politics. She has an unwavering commitment to understanding the effects of minority experiences for Muslims and the experience and the reality of Islam worldwide. And she propels young academics, scholars into a brighter and more inclusive outlook. I want to now ask Professor Samina to take the floor and provide us with your fantastic insight on the theme of Muslim women in Australia. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tahir, for this wonderful introduction. I don't know if I deserve all of that, but I still remember you coming over, and I do hope that you can come again, hopefully end of this year, when we're organizing a major international conference on Islam in a polarized world. But today in Perth, in fact, it's evening, it's 9:00 past 9, and it's a cold wintry day, blustering wind outside. But it's really an honor to be invited by MACFEST, especially our dear sister, Kesra Shahraz, and it's an honor, Tahir, that you agreed to moderate this session. And so I guess what I want to talk about is, as a Muslim woman who has worked on Muslim minority issues, especially in Australia, but also elsewhere, as to how Muslim women became a feature of Australian society, and what kind of obstacles do they face in being citizens in the society? Are they emanating from within the community, or are they imposed from outside? And how do Muslim women deal with these obstacles? Do they give in, or do they show agency in their own right? And I think in lots of ways, it's not just simply academic research for me. I've done lots of work on this, but it's also very personal, like a lot of other Muslim women who have gone through the process of being treated with reference to one identity. They may be American, they may be British, they may be Indian, they may be Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and then suddenly being identified first as Muslims and then anything else. Not because of their own choosing, but because others may choose to give that label to them. But I do want to focus mainly on exactly the Muslim women's entry into Australia. So I guess the first point that I want to emphasize is that Muslim women's presence in Australia is not really a recent phenomenon. In fact, the research that has been done on Australian history and connections or interaction between people living in what's today's Indonesia and people in the northern part of Australia tells us that between the Aboriginal communities and the people from MACFEST, there was a continuous relationship. People would come here, they'll engage in fishing, and then there were people who married Indigenous women. Some of them actually also went to Indonesia, and their descendants are also in Indonesia. Within Australia, people who interacted with people from MACFEST, they also picked up the words, and so you would find them in Indigenous languages as well. So obviously women were a part of that whole scene, because, for example, those who married fishermen who came from MACFEST, they became Muslims, so they became Muslim women in the area. And when they went to Indonesia, obviously gradually as they converted, they also grew up as Muslims. But there's less knowledge about that. What is more known about Muslim women's presence is that it started in the second half of the 19th century, when cameliers, often known as Afghan cameliers, came from British India. And they were not all necessarily Afghans. They came from today's Balochistan, even some of them from Kashmir, and also from Afghanistan. And interestingly, it also included people who came from other areas such as Turkey. But basically, the cameliers, when they came into Australia, they were the ones who opened up Australia. And so a lot of linkages that were established between, for example, Western Australia and eastern part of Australia really owes itself to those cameliers who came in with their camels, and then they opened up. Most of them were Muslims. And as they came in, they settled here, they formed their groups, they also set up mosques, and gradually they also got into this phenomena where they would go back into their country or area of origin and bring their friends, family people, and also women. And so in this, my apologies, in this context, one story that I really want to share with you is that of Muslim women who came from what is today's Pakistan. And it's a story about a very famous family in Australia called Bucks family. Now, Mr. Bucks came here. He first went to Melbourne, then went back, then came to Western Australia, and is known as the first, at least recorded Muslim, came to Western Australia. So when he went back, he brought his wife, and she stayed here for a little while. And it turns out that because he was here, and there were apparently a couple of younger daughters or female members of the family, they were here as well. The male members of the family, following Islamic custom or their knowledge of Islamic custom, wouldn't let them come out into the streets like others. So they were reported to the law enforcement authorities on the ground that he was holding them captive. And of course, it went into the judiciary. Luckily for Mr. Bucks, someone who was aware of Muslim, or what he called Muhammadan culture, reported to the magistrate that it was actually a Muslim custom. And so the decision was that Mr. Bucks would make sure that the women at least have some air outside. So they would come in, they would come out of the house, and then they would travel or walk on the street late at night so that no one could see them. They could still follow the law, but they could also follow their Islamic law. So that's a small snippet of Muslim women's initial presence here. What's also interesting is that either this woman or someone else, but from the story that I've heard, that she went back with the husband, and then a few years later, he decided to come back to Australia, and her response was, "I'm not going with you, because all I have to do is go and make lots and lots of rotis for you and your friends." And so the decision that she came to was that he was going to take another wife. and that he would then go back with that wife to Australia. So that's exactly what happened. He came with another wife, and they lived happily ever after here, but not necessarily, because she also kept going back and then forth to Australia. But this time was mainly because these Muslim women came to Australia courtesy of the Cameliers. They weren't here in their own right. So let's move into the 20th century, when initially there was some migration of Muslims, especially after the First World War. And there were some of them who came from Albania and some from Turkey. And when they came and settled in Australia, women folk came with them. Until the late 60s, what we find is that these women were always playing second fiddle to the men in their families. They were not irrelevant to the story of Muslim presence in Australia, but they were the ones who were helping the men work out how to set up their own social groups and how these social groups could interact with others. So if we look at the stories, what turns out is that there were meetings held in different people's families, and then women would obviously cook for them, prepare, have social functions. And even this Baksh family that I started my story with, even their descendants in Western Australia or in Perth had women who played very important role in that whole story. Now, they were not irrelevant in that sense. They were socially very important. But the point is that the leadership of the Muslim community was still with men. So now let's come to the 1970s onwards. 1970s, especially 1972, brought a change in Australia with the Whitlam government coming to power. In 1973, the Whitlam government ended what was known as the White Australia policy, under which, if you were of a non-white background, especially non-British, your entry into Australia was limited. But White Australia policy, when it came to an end, the government issued the guidelines to its embassies or posts that migration to Australia was not to be limited based on race, and that people of any background could enter, and if they lived here for 3 years, they could become citizens. It's in this period onwards that we see Muslim migration increasing, and with that, the number of Muslim women coming in also increasing. But again, it's not really this first phase, which starts, say, from mid-70s until the early 1990s, that we see a lot of Muslims coming in, or the number of Muslim women increasing. It basically happened after the end of the Cold War. As the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and as a number of conflicts emerged, we see people coming in as asylum seekers or as immigrants into Australia. And with that, the number of Muslims increased. And so even the number of Muslim women increased, because they came in as part of the family migration system. Now, if we look at the number of Muslim women in Australia, it's close to 400,000, because the total number of Muslims in Australia is around about 800,000 plus, and it's 3.2% of the total population. And Muslim women are just slightly under half of the total population. And so when I say close to 400,000, it's just close to, it's not exactly 400,000. And now these women come from multiple backgrounds, different nationalities, different ethnicities, different language capacities, and even different levels of education or experience. But what kind of life Muslim women have in Australia? I guess what I want to start off with is that, again, if I look back where I said it's a very personal thing, that when I came to Australia in 1979, I came in as a student, and I was referred to as that woman from Pakistan. When I started teaching at the University of Western Australia, I was still the lecturer who comes from Pakistan. But in 2001, suddenly my identity shifted. So if anything I said was not to be seen as by the others as Samina Yasmeen as an academic talking about these issues, but Muslim academic. So it changed the identity of what I was, not out of my own choosing, but because the wider community started looking at it like that. But I guess when that happened, long before that, in fact, in the early 1990s, we had decided, with the help of one recent migrant at that time, Dr. Salma Al-Khoderi, to look at the settlement needs of Muslims. And that meant that we also had to look at Muslim women and their settlement needs. So when I talk about the obstacles that Muslim women have faced, I really refer to a lot of research that we did then and the information that we've continuously gathered that really feeds into that idea. So what is it that we learned at that time? The first thing that was very significant was that, as in the earlier part of this last century, Muslim women were still in lots of ways playing second fiddle to the men. All the organizations that were set up in Australia were predominantly led by men. And even if women were part of that, they had a very small part to play. Women were subservient to men, or women were second to men in this whole story. And in that context, because they mostly came in as part of the family migration setup, women felt a lot of obstacles. They were controlled by men because men were the ones who got the visas. They were dominated by men who really used their own cultural traditions and justified controlling women. There were very few, not a lot, but there were very few cases of also domestic violence in which women, when they complained and tried to break out of those relationships, were told by other members of the Muslim family that, what's so special about you? You know, we've gone through that too. So that knowledge actually made us aware that Muslim women, even in the early 1990s, when in their own countries of origin things were moving, that they were still exposed to domestic violence, control, and domination. And there was also a problem of their men not being able to find jobs, and which created tension in the family. And so therefore it reflected on the way women, including the girls, had to deal with the story of their lives. But most of them were really focused on living their lives as citizens. And what stood out for us, and it still stands out for me and others who do this work, is that a number of these Muslim women, especially once they got married, were focused not so much on realizing their own potential, but creating an environment in which their children could become better citizens. Their focus was on being a good citizen by bringing up better citizens. And that's a very positive contribution that these women were making. Their questions, or their answers to our questions about settlement needs, also indicated that their way of looking at being in Australia was very different. When we talked to men, they were focused on this bigger picture. Are we recognized or not as a community? Are we being given political representation or not? Or what kind of organizations we can create? When we went to women and asked them, their main areas of concern were, do we have a house close to where our kids can catch a bus? Can we get housing which is suitable for our needs? Do we have enough structures or the design of the house that fits in within our cultural ways of being? In other words, can we really have a house in which you don't enter straight into the living room with an attached kitchen or a little dining area? Can we have a kitchen that is slightly separate? Their needs, their questions were very different from those of men. So this is where I want to leave this, because I'm aware that otherwise I can give you lots and lots of stories. Intra-communal obstacles, therefore, were there when we started our research, and they have continued, because a number of women that we talk to, either anecdotally we come across that information, or they tell us that they do face still very similar problems. The domestic violence hasn't disappeared. In fact, as the number of Muslims coming into Australia has increased, along with other ethnic communities as well, or other religious communities, the incidence of domestic violence has increased. Now, we could say that it's proportionately, maybe not higher, but it's very hard for us to come up with real figures. But domestic violence is there. Control factors are also there. But what is interesting is that despite those internal community obstacles, Muslim women have continued to be educated, and they've actually continued to make their mark within Australia. And I'll come to that once I've talked about obstacles that come in the way of Muslim women from the wider community. And what are those obstacles? I think, as I had mentioned, that 9/11 changed my identity, or in the way I was talked about, and sometimes still talked about, to not just being Samina Yasmeen, but a Muslim woman who was an academic. I think 9/11 had a huge impact on the way Muslim women were looked at and their position. As soon as it happened, the idea that somehow the area that Professor Tahir Abbas specializes in, that Muslims are nothing but radicalized individuals, or in fact terrorists, that idea at the global level obviously had its impact within Australia as well. People started looking at Muslims as the outsiders. And so previously, when Muslims were seen as the other, it wasn't just because they were Muslims. It is because they were from Asia, or it is because they were of a different ethnic background. But 9/11 brought their religious identity to the forefront. And so as a result of that, not just simply Muslim men, but even Muslim women became the focus of attention of the wider community. And in that, women, especially who subscribed to traditional Islamic dress code, were seen as the outsiders. Interestingly, they were both seen as the signifier of the difference between Muslims and the other, but they were also seen as the oppressed members of the Muslim community. Somehow assumed, which I'm sure Tahir can talk about, even in other Muslim spaces, we see similar stories. It was assumed that women were wearing hijab not because it was their choice, but because it was imposed on them. So somehow Muslim women got the brunt of the negative reaction of 9/11 events. When we did initial research, it appeared that women who weren't dressed up in the traditional dress code, they were relatively spared. So for example, personally, I was not ever attacked because I don't cover my hair. But women who wore hijab, they told us stories where they were constantly targeted, commented on, and denied jobs sometimes, or denied even access to their housing, because they would go to a place and would be told by the people who were renting the place to say, oh no, someone has already taken it, making it pretty obvious that they weren't getting the house because they were wearing hijab. But what we find gradually over a period of time is that this identification of the Muslim woman as the other has actually extended even to women who don't cover their hair. And one example that I do want to point out is of the significant Muslim female leaders who have come into politics. So from Pakistan, Dr. Mehreen Faruqi, who came to Sydney initially and was a member of the New South Wales Parliament as a member of the Greens, she became the first female member of Australian Senate. Female Muslim member, sorry, not female member, female Muslim member of the Australian Senate. And it's interesting that the moment she opens her mouth to say things that are not considered to be acceptable, and she receives a lot of negative comments. And so negativity towards Muslim women gradually over a period of time has extended from just focused on the hijab-clad women to even others who are seen as Muslim. So there is this notion of the Muslim women being othered, which has therefore impacted on their right to jobs, impacted on their right to acceptance. And as I said, even someone as significant as a senator also being targeted off and on. So having talked about this, what I do want to point out is that I don't want you to think that Muslim women in Australia have a really bad experience. Because what I constantly am reminded of is that despite the obstacles, both from within the Muslim community, with culture, patriarchy, and even misinterpretation of religious ideas, have forced women to be dealing with internal pressures, and also the external environment in which the wider community looks at them as somehow the focus of attention. Despite all that negativity, Muslim women have been very active, agentic in their own right, and they have tried to change, one, the images of the wider community about what a Muslim woman stands for. And at the same time, they've also taken stand against the male members of the Muslim community, or even other women who don't agree with the idea of women's rights in Australia. So let me talk about first their agentic activism vis-a-vis the wider community. The more the wider community came up with the idea that Muslim women were oppressed, the more we see the emergence of women's groups that actually started talking about their rights, and a lot of them wearing hijab would do a lot of activities in the social sphere, in the political sphere, to show that Muslim women actually have a personality, they have an agency, they can contribute to the community. And in that sense, they became very important messengers of what Islam is really all about. They started telling others as to what the Islamic teachings are. They started divesting people of the notion that everyone, just because he or she happens to be a Muslim, could be seen as a potential terrorist or an actual terrorist. So vis-a-vis the wider community, therefore, they have had a huge active active agency. Vis-a-vis the domestic or intra-Muslim groups, they've been equally agentic. What we find is that there have been smaller groups such as Muslim Women Support Group, which has tried its best to help women as they've come in either as refugees, asylum seekers, or just as part of the family migration system to meet the needs. And in case they've had any problems faced because of the Muslim community itself or because of other settlement issues, they've been there to help them. So that's one group. But then there are other groups, for example, Muslim Women's Group that deals with human rights and is currently being run by a really vibrant, very active former student of mine who is of Afghan background. She has been extremely active in trying to look at the questions that impact on Muslim women, not just simply from the wider community, but also issues from within the Muslim community. And so I'm just giving you two examples, but these two examples in itself tell us that there are women who use secular terms or secular stroke religious terms to break the image of Muslim women being other, either at the national level or within the community. And then there are women who use religious ideas and also do the same work. So in lots of ways, therefore, what we find is women being actively engaged in trying to deal with the obstacles that are facing. Another new phenomena that's been emerging in Australia is, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, that there's a new or fresh wave of migrants who have come in, professionals. And interestingly, the number of women who have come in as independent migrants without coming as member of the family system, that's also started increasing. It's still very small, but those women who are here, they are becoming very active in organizing little groups, not just simply of the women who have come on their own, but also other women who are very well educated and maybe are looking for jobs, looking for opportunities, and they're trying to help each other. So basically, I guess what I want to point out is that Muslim women have been very agentic. And I've already talked about Dr. Mehreen Faruqi, but then we have, again, one of our youngest, in fact, the youngest female Muslim senator who's been elected in the last elections in 2022, Fatma Peyman. She comes from Afghanistan, also lived in Pakistan for a while, and then she came to Australia, studied at our university, and now she's the youngest senator. Dr. Anne Ali, from Egypt, she became the first female parliamentarian in Australia. So if we look at the whole spread of Muslim women's agentic activism, where I want to leave it so that at least we have some time for questions and answers, and maybe Tahir can ask me some more questions. We see a story in which Muslim women from that earlier days when they had to come out at night to go up and down the road, they've moved quite a long way. And they're in lots of professional fields. They're in the political realm. They're also in the social realm. A lot of them continue still to focus on bringing up good children. But there are others who go across these boundaries, and they are trying to change not just simply the views of the wider community about what it means to be a Muslim woman, but also views of the Muslim communities themselves as well, so that they're working on different platforms on different fronts, and hopefully they will continue to make their mark in Australia and at the same time globally as well. I think I've spoken enough now, and Tahir, over to you so that you can tell me what to do, and I'll have a sip of tea.
Well, thank you so much. It was a really useful and comprehensive overview of the history of Muslim women in Australia, going back to the very beginning. The first Muslim migrants to Australia were these camel traders, all the way to the post-war kind of economic migration that we see in other parts of the global north, of which Australia is part. I have a number of questions, but I want to kind of ask about intergenerational change. So in the early 1970s, it was women who joined their husbands as part of a primary labor migration. And we now have at least 2 generations since then. And you alluded to some of this in your comments towards the end in terms of the success stories. What's been happening with respect to things like education and employment patterns for women over the generations? We know everywhere in the global north and in the global south that women are outperforming men in education. That's, degree subjects, even now have more PhDs, but women have than men. But how is that translated into labor market outcomes? And what kind of labor market penalties do Muslim women face? Because we have this idea of a hit you get because being of a different color or religion, for the same job, you get lower pay and lower opportunities. So is there progress in that respect in terms of looking at generational change over time? And if so, what are the characteristics of it?
Okay, first of all, I think what I always find interesting is that when women came in the 1970s, some of them actually also went into the labor market and they didn't get jobs. Not a lot of them, but those who wanted, they were able to get the jobs. But what is quite apparent is that over a period of time, intergenerationally, the number of Muslim women, girl children, and therefore women, they have continued to be educated. So the level of education among Australian Muslim women has always been quite high. I can't give you the exact figures, but every time I've looked at it, I've been surprised myself. Now, has that been translated into their access to the labor market or not? which I had alluded to in my discussion. In some cases, it has impacted on their access to labor market, and especially in terms of jobs, for example, in the delis where you'd want to go and serve. But not all these women have actually been stopped by these obstacles. For example, I remember one young woman we were interviewing, and she said she went in and she wanted to get a job, and the owner of the shop said, sorry, you're wearing hijab, I can't give it to you. So she convinced him that he should let her serve the customers for a couple of days. And if it impacts on his business, then he can choose not to give her the job. She said she wore the hijab, she served people, and it didn't impact on it. So she ended up keeping the job. But she was lucky. It doesn't mean that others have had the similar experience. There are a number of cases where women didn't have access to the job. Now, in terms of equality of pay, what's interesting is, at least in case of Australia, it's not necessarily along the ethnic or religious lines, it's along gender lines. So men have always had more sort of money or pay compared to women. So once you get into the labor market, you tend to be treated as an equal, but it's really that access. And what's interesting is it's not just simply because the wider community isn't willing to let Muslim women have the jobs. Even within the Muslim community, they've often brought in this notion that men are supposed to be the providers. So they find it difficult to let women go out and get the jobs. But that situation is changing now. So I can straight away think of a number of young women who are in legal profession, who are in medical profession, who are in teaching profession, who are managing, who are in banking sectors, and all of them are also in social welfare services. All of them are making their mark. The proportion of women who get married and then don't stay in the workforce is not really that great anymore. So overall, the picture is quite positive. But does that mean that the women are not facing any obstacles? I think that's probably would be really painting a too bright a picture, but it's a lot better intergenerationally than it was before.
Okay, that's good to know. I mean, I think that that's quite consistent with the kinds of bits of change and progress we see, but with still lots of obstacles. And just trying to bring it up to speed in terms of social movements or feminist movements. How do Muslim women experience that realm? Because there's a bit of a critique of kind of liberal ideas of progressive feminism, which is often white for the purposes of white women without generalizing too much. And then minority women, ethnic and religious minority women, they tend to get left out of that. And even when it comes to events and speaking on women in sites of conflict in different parts of the world, the ethnic matching isn't quite there, let's put it. So what are these challenges saying about the position of Muslim women in Australia vis-a-vis ideas of feminism and ideas of being progressive? And I know that in Islam there's an Islamic feminism angle as well. And what does that play, if at all, a role in this whole space?
Okay, Islamic feminism is the one that I think seems to be more apparent among Australian Muslim women. The liberal, secular feminism, which has been made mostly white feminism, hasn't really provided enough space for Muslim women. And I think even Muslim women themselves haven't really operated in that space, maybe because of the terms on which women argue their cases. But it doesn't mean that those who are not subscribing to Islamic feminist ideas, they are not fighting for women's rights, or as women of ethnically diverse background or religiously diverse background. So they do talk about their rights, their needs, what the system needs to provide for them, but it hasn't really become a movement, which maybe you might be thinking of development, say, for example, in Europe, particularly UK, It hasn't come to that level yet. So I wouldn't say that there's a critical mass of women who can say, we are the non-Islamic feminist Muslim feminist movement. They're there, they're talking about their rights as Australian citizens, and it's couched in more citizenship language, but not in the traditional feminist language. And what is interesting, what I find is that even as an academic, when I look at sometimes the units or the courses that are offered about feminism, and they would happily talk about the history of feminism, but Muslim feminist discussions seem to be separate from that. So it happens elsewhere. It's, bringing in Muslim experience as a way of indicating that Muslim women have also fought their battles isn't still, I think it's not in the thinking of the people who are focusing on feminist sort of approaches in Australia.
Still some work to do, although it's not perfect here either. And there tends to be internal ethnic issues as well. Just in the Netherlands, Turkish Muslim women have a different approach to life than Moroccan Dutch women and Pakistanis because of these kind of ethnic cleavages, but also issues of capital and community capital in terms of how people feel integrated or organized within themselves. Last question before I open up. Now, we talk a lot about the Muslim women. What about the Muslim men? Are they helping, or are they still a problem? And where are they making progress, and what more can be done? Because there's always room for more to be done.
Like, I think it's when you would talk about the diversity in how Muslims respond to the spaces that they live in, it's not just simply along ethnic or nationalist lines or even economic sort of lines. I think it's also in terms of the thinking and approach. And so you do find some Muslim men who would be very supportive of their women and other women as well. And there are other men who, no matter what you do, they would try and stop you and basically present themselves as the leaders, and everyone else has to be, or women have to be, the second in line for them. But I won't say that Muslim men are in the same frame as they were, for example, in the early 1990s. There's a definite shift. And if I can sort of reflect on that, I think it could also be that they're second, third generation Muslim men. So while they may still have traditional ideas, patriarchal ideas, they are more exposed to the wider community, and they've grown up, they've been educated here. So they have a slightly different outlook. It hasn't totally changed, but I still see a shift from, say, even early 1990s to now. But then there are men who haven't really been that supportive. And in fact, that's, again, what I was alluding to, in the cases of domestic violence. And some of them have been horrific. Even using tech-based violence has been quite common. And in fact, the Australian government has taken a very strong stand against that. And that only happens because some men think that once they are here, or even if they've grown up here, they still seem to think that what they think a Muslim woman should be is the way a Muslim woman should be. So they start putting controls in and denying women their real rights. And there's also an assumption that somehow being in Australia gives women the wrong idea of their rights, and sort of they forget their limits. And so there's always an effort to remind them of their limits. So I think there's a diversity, and I really go back to the fact that it's not the ethnic or the national or the status, economic status, it's the thinking and what they've learned from their family environment about the extent to which they need to stand by women in their families.
I mean, I suppose there are a couple of different moving spaces here. There's the situation within households and generations over time, but there's also Australian society. And it's moved on from the whites-only immigration policy to the millennials, whatever the term we use, people under 30 tend to be much more comfortable with diversity and inclusion, and much more critical, much more independent. There's also problems of less social trust and less political trust, but that's a problem of democracies in general too. So it has to be a two-way street. So the Muslim communities are not in isolation, but there's also majority society. Have there been positive steps made by different institutions, different foundations, establishments, almost in Australia to take ownership of this? Because I think Australian politics does have this sort of roller coaster effect of really good ideas followed by some really bad ideas. So what's the current space at the moment? Are there spaces for hope going forward? And can Muslim communities build on this?
Look, there's a lot of hope going on. In fact, as you were talking about the composition of the society is changing. In case of Australia, our foreign minister is of non-white background from Malaysia. And in fact, it actually gives you a sense of what the way the system, or at least part of the society, looks at the women's roles, and that it's not just simply white men and then second line is white women, but that women based on their capacity can come in. And then one thing that I have noticed is that the Labour Party has been very active in supporting women from diverse backgrounds, so religious, ethnic, national backgrounds. And so when I said that Dr. Anna Lee became the first female member of the Australian Parliament, and that's because the Labour Party was willing to give her a ticket. Now, she really fought a very good battle, and she managed to come into sort of win the seat under quite a lot of odds. But that was possible because the Labour Party stood by her. And then the youngest member of the Senate, Fatma Payman, again, she was given the ticket by the Labour Party. Now, I'm not saying that the Liberals haven't done their role. The Greens obviously have, because that's why Dr. Mehreen Faruqi came into the Senate. But there are groups that are beginning to realize that Muslim women, or Muslims in general, they need to be included. Where the problem does come in is that not all the Muslims are willing to be included. So I'm sure the debates about whether it's Islamic to participate in elections or not, they find their way in Australia as well. But there's definitely a push in the wider community, especially with Labour parties, to open up the space for cultural, ethnic, religious diversity, of which the Muslim women have benefited from.
So we've talked about the economy, with generational change, we've talked about feminism, women. Let's say something about Islam. I'm mindful we've got about just over 5 minutes and there's no questions, so I'm hogging the floor a little bit. So in terms of the Muslim education sphere, in terms of Islamic education, has that evolved over the years? Are imams being trained in the Australian context, or is there still the question of just inviting people over to deliver the khutbahs and arrange the curriculum and so on? And have educational strategies in terms of Islamic education improved or developed over these years? And what is it looking like at the moment?
Well, Islamic schooling system in Australia really has been evolving since the 1970s. And initially, they were very strongly supported by the Saudis, and they followed Saudi curriculum. Then other schools started following South African curriculum. Some of them sort of got other areas as well, but mostly these were the two. What we do find is that over a period of time, Australian Federation of Islamic Councils established their own schools. And Islamic schools in Australia, they have to make sure that they also provide the local curriculum. And so there are different degrees to which they provide sort of the knowledge of Islam, but it's all along the lines that kids grow up better if they have some access to their religious backgrounds. A lot of people who are migrants, who are asylum seekers, they tend to send their kids to Islamic schools. Some very well-off people also do that because they think that's where the character would be built. Now, what about the imams and the religious scholars? It's basically changed a lot, as it's happened in Britain as well. Previously, you would just import someone, but then what we find is that people went from here and they got trained and they came back and then they started teaching about Islam. But there's also now the local sort of group of imams that has come up. But what I find interesting is, and there's a story being sort of building up at the moment, is that there's an Australian National Imams Council, or I'm sort of giving it the name, but it's about National Council of Imams. That's engaged in a conflict, sort of an argument with Australian Federation of Islamic Council on whether the chicken, the way they're slaughtered, is that halal or not. So what we're finding is that two bodies of knowledge that are competing with each other about what does halal certification stand for, and when is it real certification, when it is not genuine. So ANIC has one opinion, and FAC, Islamic Federation of Islamic Council, has got another. And so even though we have got local imams now, you still have the divisions about Eid. Do you have to cite the moon, or do you have to know the cycles? All of them continue. And so mixtures of modernity, sort of middle of the frame and interpretation to extremes, they're all there. And so you find that even in Islamic schools.
It's interesting, you know, we sort of look at sort of the Muslim experience in the West and think there's plenty of positives and spaces of hope, but sometimes we carry a lot of our own ideas way into the future, and then we claw it back down to patriarchy and kind of tribalism and sort of essential problems there. But it's always stop go. It's sort of hit and miss. We learn the lessons, we go back, we learn more lessons. So I think that it's good to hear lots of progress over Australia. Even, you know, we had the last time we had a proper conversation was maybe 15 years ago about this, and just talking to people in Australia at the time and looking at the picture as it's evolved over the last 40, 50 years specifically. Lots to look forward to. I think there's lots of change. And of course, we can't ignore the demographics. The numbers of Muslims everywhere are just growing. And, you know, we have the problems of radicalization and extremism and how we get painted as potential terrorists, but there's a huge halal economy that cannot be ignored. There's huge investments in well, everything from football clubs to tourism in the Gulf states now in particular. That it's changing the balance of power, I guess, and also the old global powers have shifted as well. So there's lots happening right now, and that's happened in our lifetimes, and perhaps lots more to look forward to. I think we've got maybe a minute or two, so maybe, yes, I mean, if you any last words or comments from you, and then we can just say goodbye to our audience and leave them in peace. Any last thoughts?
Well, basically, I just think in terms of the overall comparative sort of view of Muslim women in Australia, it's different in lots of ways from what happens elsewhere, but also it's very similar. So there's an Australian color to how Muslim women are living, but it's not so unique that we would say that it's just an Australian woman's Islam. You see similarities, and hopefully when I was talking, it was obvious to you and to others. You see similarities with Muslim women, say in Britain, in Canada, in France, in America. And I think they learn from each other. And there's what I haven't talked about is the global network of these women who also learn from each other. So that's it.
Perhaps on that note, we could do this again, same time, same place next year for the next MACFEST, and we'll go global then. But I think I'm going to hand it back to our organizers to finish off, and I think that concludes the session. So thank you from me to Samina. I enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you all enjoyed it too. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Thank you, Tahir. Thank you, Samina, for this wonderful discussion. Absolutely fascinating. And thank you so much for explaining it all in such a way that it was actually possible for me to picture it, the whole history it's really good, you know, and the language that you use is so accessible. Thank you so much. And yeah, wonderful. Thank you again.
Thank you for including me, and thank you, Tahir, for taking the time as well.
So I'd like to, before we finish, I'd like to encourage people once again, if you are around in the UK, we've got a wonderful event next Saturday in Longside Library, women's only event, Eid celebration, and then on 1st of July we've got a musical event at the Lowry, also in Manchester. And now you can see the slide for our next Zoom event, travel writing. So please do join us again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.